Maleen Thiele from the Max Planck Institute of Evolutionary Anthropology from Leipzig, Germany.
Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, okay. So, in my presentation, I will talk about infants' object memory in observed joint attention context, and this is collaborative work with Steven Kalinke, Christine Michel, and Daniel Haun. I would like to start with a question that has inspired plenty of infancy research, and that is the question, how do infants come to learn about objects in their environment? And of course, there are many answers to this question. One that is most important for my presentation today is that human infants rely on other people to organize their attention and learning and to acquire information about the objects they are surrounded with. Now, as most of you likely know, many studies and theories on the ontogeny of object-related learning in social contexts have emphasized the importance of joint attention for object-related learning, namely joint attention between infant and adult and an object of mutual attention, assuming that the triadic connectedness between two social partners and an object enables referential communication and knowledge transmission. However, most previous studies have focused on a very specific joint attention situation. And I will refer to this view as the traditional view in the following. And my motivation for today is to talk about ways how to broaden this long-dominant traditional view. And I will do so by presenting you a study that contributes to a growing body of literature, suggesting that the way we have looked at joint attention for a long time is very specific and that it tends to underestimate the richness and the actual diversity of infant social interaction and learning. So what defines the traditional view? One characteristic that is most important for the studies I'm presenting you today is the strong focus on joint attention situations in which the infant was involved as an active interaction partner, directly addressed by an adult. So this is the setting that we have looked at the phenomenon for decades. However, own participation is not the only way in which infants encounter social interactions, right? So in addition, infants spend a lot of their time observing others, including others' social interactions without any own involvement in the situation. And although this may seem obvious, this observational third-party perspective on social interactions has received surprisingly little attention in the infancy literature, especially in empirical studies focusing on the first year of life. So a central goal of our study was to fill this gap, namely by broadening the long-dominant focus on self-experience interactions and studying object-related learning in observed joint attention contexts. But before diving into the details of this study, I will briefly summarize the findings from one of our previous studies that was foundational for the study I'm presenting you in the main part. And in this previous study, we provided first evidence that similar to infants learning during self-experienced social interactions, observing third-party joint attention to an object can enhance infants' object encoding, which is a fundamental precondition for later emerging more complex forms of object-related learning. And more specifically, we found that when being familiarized with an abstract object in a third-party joint attention situation, showing two adults engaging in eye contact before looking at an object together, and then showing this familiarized object outside the learning situation next to a novel object, then 9-month-old German infants looked relatively longer at the novel object. And according to the logic of the paradigm, this novelty preference in the preferential looking phase indicates that infants had encoded the familiarized object during the previous joint attention situation, meaning that they had stored its visual features in their memory, while the novel object still required attention to be processed, and therefore it captured more attention. That's the logic of the paradigm. So taking a closer look at the data of this study, infants' novelty preference was significantly higher following observed joint attention, including an interplay between mutual gazing and referential looking to an object, compared to 3 control conditions involving 2 actors looking at an object individually, or in parallel, or not at all. But importantly, all control conditions were lacking this interpersonal sharedness between the partners and an object. So, in addition, and importantly, we found a very similar result pattern in a matched first-party experiment in which infants were, like in previous traditional studies, directly addressed by an adult on screen instead of witnessing a third-party interactions between others. And together we think that these findings suggest that not only self-experience, but also, and this is the crucial extension in our study, observed joint attention has a supportive effect on infants' object memory at the young age of 9 months. However, one question that remains unclear from our study is what kinds of information infants encode about a visual object in a joint attention context, because the novelty preference paradigm can only inform us about quantitative differences in encoding, like more or less encoding, but not so much about qualitative differences, like what is being encoded about the object. But this would be an important extension because it would allow us to understand whether infants make inferences about the communicative aspect when observing a third-party joint attention interaction. And the idea for this assumption comes from the first-party interaction literature suggesting a so-called communication-induced memory bias. And according to this bias, it is assumed that communicative context does not increase the processing of all available information in a situation, but instead it focuses and it channels infants' memory towards specific object features. So, in other words, one and the same object is represented and is assumed to be represented and processed in a fundamentally different way when encountered in a communicative setting as opposed to a non-communicative social context. And specifically, the memory bias assumes that the presence of communicative context biases infants to selectively encode identity-relevant intrinsic object properties, that is, object properties allowing the infant to find an object in the future outside the situation or to detect other objects of the same kind. In contrast, transient extrinsic object features, that is, features that are tied to the specific situation, such as where the object has been located during encoding, are assumed to be less relevant. And while this effect has been quite robustly shown in adults in different paradigms, supporting evidence with infants is very limited and also a bit controversial. And as far as I'm aware, there are only 3 studies that have really investigated the effect in the first year of life. The first study introducing the idea came from Jennifer Yohn and colleagues. And in this study, 9-month-old Hungarian infants were presented with a very rich communicative setting, right, including waving towards the infant, using infant-directed speech, pointing to an object, looking at an object. So it was a really rich setting, and the focus was not so much on joint visual attention only, but instead of a combination of multiple social cues. In 2019, Priya Silverstein and colleagues published a failed replication attempt of this original study. And then there was a third study by Yuko Okumura and colleagues from 2016 who, in contrast to the other 2 studies, specifically studied the role of gaze cues to disentangle the influence of joint visual attention from the multitude of social cues presented in the stimuli by Yohn and colleagues. And the authors found, conceptually in line with the original study, that 9-month-old Japanese infants selectively encoded identity information when engaging with an adult in joint visual attention to an object, as opposed to parallel attention to an object without interpersonal coordination. However, this finding has not been replicated yet, so we thought it would be a nice contribution to the debate to first try to replicate this finding, and then ideally use this paradigm to study whether also observed joint attention can elicit a similar memory bias. And at the background of the replication crisis, I would like to point out that a central methodological goal of this project was to translate the original study paradigm into a screen-based eye-tracking task and to develop a data processing algorithm that would allow us to extract look-away-based criteria based on eye-tracking raw data instead of relying on manual coding procedures as in the original studies. And I'm mentioning this just in case someone is interested in the technical details of eye-tracking, because actually I'd be very curious to receive feedback and to discuss our approach at any time during the conference or afterwards. Okay, so let me illustrate the sequence of the experimental procedure using the third-party experiment as an example. Like in the study by Okumura and colleagues, each trial consisted of an action phase and an outcome phase. In the action phase, infants saw an abstract object embedded within either a joint attention scenario, showing 2 actors engaging in eye contact before alternating their gaze between a visible object and their partner, or a parallel attention scenario showing 2 actors turning away from one another to clearly demonstrate that there was no interaction going on between them, and then looking at a visible object in parallel without sharing any eye contact or even seeing the other person. Then the scene was occluded before it revealed 1 of 3 different outcomes. Either nothing had changed, the same object was shown at the same position, that was the baseline, or the location had changed, so now the same object was positioned at a different screen location, or a completely novel object was shown, that was the identity change condition. I have an example video to illustrate the sequence of one trial, showing the gaze pattern of a 9-month-old infant watching a joint attention scene with a location change outcome. I hope it's not too loud. Okay. Okay, so this time our main dependent measure was the infant's violation of expectation response in the outcome phase, measured by the infant's looking time at the object until looking away from it for the first time. Following the logic of the paradigm, we assume that if infants look longer at a change outcome compared to the baseline, then this increased attention or surprise reaction would indicate that they had stored information about the changed feature in their memory. First, let's look at the results of the replication study in which infants were directly addressed by an adult on screen. On the y-axis, we see the mean first look duration at the object until looking away from it for the first time. The longer the duration, the looking duration at a change outcome compared to the baseline, the stronger the surprise reaction and the encoding of a changed feature. In the eye contact condition, we found that infants showed both an identity and a location bias. So in other words, they were surprised when the location of the object had changed. They were also surprised when the identity had changed, which makes sense, I think. Importantly, however, infants' looking time response was significantly higher at the identity changes as compared to the location changes in this condition. Also in the no eye contact condition, both changes were surprising for infants. However, in contrast to the eye contact condition, none of the change outcomes was more surprising than the other. So together we think that these findings conceptually replicate the general finding by Okumura and colleagues in that it shows a selective response towards identity changes in the joint attention condition. This gave us the confidence to use the paradigm and study our third-party question, and here are the results. Again, the data looked so similar compared to the first-party study. We did find some smaller differences, but for now I'd like to highlight that again we found a significant interaction between eye contact and identity change, but not between eye contact and location change, indicating that also in the observational setting, identity information was treated in a special way in the communicative setting as opposed to the non-communicative setting. And for the matter of transparency, I'd like to add that when using an alternative pre-registered data extraction methods, such as a method mimicking a 2-second look-away measure, we did find some differences in the detailed data pattern, but consistently across all measures, infants' looking times at identity changes seem to kind of peak out in the communicative condition as opposed to the non-coordinated parallel attention condition. Okay, so in summary, our studies show that not only self-experienced, but also observed joint attention has a facilitating effect on infants' object memory at 9 months of age. And second, this memory effect seems to be relatively specific in that it biases infants to selectively encode information relevant for them to recognize and learn about an object in the future. So what does this mean for our understanding of social learning in infancy? And I will tell you what we think it means. So we think it means that by broadening the traditional predominant focus on infant-directed social interactions and by acknowledging observation-based forms of social learning, the infant's learning environment is suddenly full of additional learning opportunities that we seem to have overlooked or at least underestimated for a very long time. And more than that, our findings indicate that infants' learning through observation seems to be organized through mechanisms such as joint attention, that in direct pedagogical settings have been theorized to be a hallmark of human sociality and learning. So this raises the possibility that observational learning is not just also somehow important, but that it may indeed represent an equally relevant opportunity for infants to develop their uniquely human cognitive repertoire. I would like to end with a brief outlook on the second approach we are currently taking to broaden another aspect of the traditional view, and that is to rethink the long dominant focus on visual cues of interpersonal sharedness. The problem with this one-sided view is that it neglects situations where infant and adult don't engage in eye contact, but yet share joint attention to an object, such as in situations like this, where the triadic connectedness is established through physical means, such as mutual touch or interpersonal proximity. So it follows that the strong focus on visual cues again underestimates the infant's actual joint attention experience and competence. So to better account for the diversity in the expression of joint attention, part of my current postdoc project is to broaden the traditional view by reconceptualizing the phenomenon more inclusively, including both visual and physical cues of shared attention, again focusing on the observational perspective, which also in this growing research area remains a substantial gap. I would like to close with 2 final remarks. First, I want to point out that we are of course not the first noticing the need of broadening our perspectives on joint attention and infant social learning more generally. Especially cross-cultural researchers and anthropologists have long called for greater awareness that the long dominant focus on infant-directed interactions and visual cues of communication tends to favor a very specific interaction style that is predominant in Western cultures but not representative for the learning experience infants make in many other parts of the world. For example, in contexts where children predominantly rely on observation-based forms of learning. Luckily, the studies I've presented you today are just part of a much bigger ongoing movement in the community, aiming to eventually use this awareness more and to kind of invest more efforts into studying alternative pathways of social learning, also in study environments where the traditional studied view represents the predominant learning context for infants. And this brings me to the end of my presentation. I would like to say thank you, especially to my co-authors of the 2 papers I've presented you today, as well as to the many people working behind the scenes, and to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maleen, for this very interesting talk. We have time for questions. Yeah.
It seems to me that one of the reasons why you may get this focus on object identity is because the infant seeing this communicative scenario is expecting a label or wanting a label or is curious about a label, right? It's inherently being driven by that. And I don't know if the literature has established that or not. I'm not very familiar with it. But I think one of the ways to potentially get at this additional explanation or enrichment of why this phenomenon is happening is by taking really familiar objects to the child instead of novel objects. So have you or anyone else in the field manipulated whether or not object novelty is an intrinsic part of this phenomenon?
I would say that it's a maybe necessary part for this kind of paradigm. I totally agree that this would be an important follow-up, because so what we wanted to do is to really replicate this study paradigm, and there it was important to have this novel object thing. But one central assumption that the communication-induced memory bias makes, like in line with the natural pedagogy account, is this idea, right, that an object in the communicative setting is represented as an example of its kind, right? And this, for example, and I think like the original study, the authors also draw conclusions about it, like, okay, so this is a piece of information that is important to generalize to kinds. However, I don't really think that this study paradigm can tell us about it. And I think when you just mentioned this, like using familiar objects, I think this would help us to get into this direction maybe also, to, for example, show the objects that infants know, and then afterwards it's like the same object from the same category or not, right? So I think it would be a great follow-up for sure, yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one more question.
Wonderful studies. I think it's really important, the demonstrations. One question that I would ask is if the object that you co-attend would be a person, a third person whose identity would change, but it wouldn't be a kind change, but in case of persons, so would you expect the same results?
I'm sorry, I think I have to think about it a bit more. I know what you're aiming to, and I think it's a great question also in terms of, so I mean, we have of course thought also about other aspects that we could broaden about this traditional view, and one of this is that we are heavily focusing on objects also in these situations, but joint attention situations of course also include other people, and so I think in this direction it's a great question, but I'm not sure what the paradigm, like what we would predict. I think I don't have a good answer to this. Do you have a guess what you?
Yeah, well, I haven't done that, so, but I have a hypothesis. Some studies really show that person identity and monitoring persons in a interpersonal situation is very central and pretty early. So I would expect that it could work quite early. Mm-hmm. So in object individuation studies, Luca Bonatti's humans first hypothesis. So it showed that for person identity, you have a 10-month-old person identification within this shoe and carry paradigm. So that would suggest that this may actually work because of its importance in one's interpersonal sphere. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Unfortunately, that's all the time we got. Let's thank our speaker.